500,000 years ago, fathers saved the human race. Explain.
Okay. So we have really, really dependent offspring, as anyone who's a parent knows. So when your baby's born, it's completely helpless. And the reason for that is it's born a good probably 9 months to 12 months too early. And that's because we're bipedal and we have enormous brains. So the only way that our babies can fit through the narrowed pelvic canal is to be born early. And this started happening about 1.8 million years ago when the brain was just becoming too big to get through the birth canal at full size, and therefore we started birthing our babies early. And for about the first sort of 1.3 million years, the way that women had dealt with having these really dependent offspring was to rely on female kin to help them raise them, to help them babysit, do whatever. And that was absolutely fine for about 1.3 million years. And then 500,000 years ago, our brains expanded massively again. And at that point, we again had to birth our babies even earlier. And at that point, women basically did not have the capacity to help each other and still cope with their own offspring anymore because they were so needy and so dependent. And so the next sort of genetically related person stepped in, and that was Dad. And if that hadn't happened, and it's really rare in the mammalian line for a dad to invest, only 5% of mammals have investing fathers, and we are the only ape that has an investing father. So it's really, really unusual for it to have evolved. And it evolved because the pressure was so great on the species that that's what had to happen. And genuinely, he did save the human race, because if that hadn't happened, our species would just have died out because we wouldn't have been able to replace our population. We were a very small population at the time, and we just simply would have just, disappeared, become extinct. So it is true to say that unless dads had stepped in, that would have been it.
Wow.
What a start. We can end the podcast.
Yeah, that's it.
That's all we needed to know.
I finally feel useful.
Yeah.
It's great.
Oh my goodness.
How long would women have been gestating for? If that makes sense.
Yeah,
like,
okay.
What should the period be? Should it be kind of 12, 18 months?
We don't really know. We think it would probably have to be around 18 months,
Right.
probably double what it
Okay.
is, really. If you think that the baby's brain actually carries on growing quite rapidly in the first sort of 2 years of life, you wouldn't expect all of that to happen in the womb, but probably a good at least 18 months, possibly even to 2 years.
Wow.
Because it's just, our brains are 6 times bigger than they should be for a mammal of our size. So there's a huge amount of growth. And usually what happens in apes is that all does happen in the womb. So if you see a chimpanzee baby, they come out and there's a little bit of, blurriness, but generally they're clambering around and doing their own thing, a few days after birth. They're really pretty independent little beings. Whereas, ours are completely useless. And that's because they're still rapidly developing this brain. The motor functions aren't there. A lot of the sensory functions still aren't there, like vision isn't there. They can't coordinate their limbs. Obviously, they're completely incapable of, looking after themselves, feeding themselves, even defecating on their own, all these sorts of things. And so that's why they're so incredibly dependent. But they really, when we look at the other apes, we are really, really unusual that that's what we're like.
Right.
I'd never thought of that. It never even crossed my mind that could be a thing. And it's one of those kind of like mind-blowing moments to consider it all. How did you come to that conclusion? What bit of research were you exploring? And what was that kind of eureka moment for you?
It's not just my work that did that. I had a really good supervisor when I was doing my master's called Kathy Key. And she was the one who sort of did a lot of work. And she did some really interesting work looking at energetics and survival, because obviously it's quite hard to recreate 500,000 years ago. And she, using those energetics, she worked out at what point sort of the evolutionary pressures would have been there for fathers to step in. So she was the one that pinpointed 500,000 years ago, essentially, as being the moment. And then if we look at all the other evidence that comes in, things like the archaeological record, the time when sort of childhood and adolescence developed. So again, as actually animals, humans are the only animals that have a childhood and adolescent stage. And we have that again because it takes such a long time for our children to develop. So they need a really massive period of time when they're still pretty much dependent, to be honest, on their parents to learn everything, to be able to, cope with the social complexities, the technological complexities of our world. Other apes, again, other animals don't have that. They basically go from infant to juvenile and then they're an adult. So it's about working out when those life stages evolved. What we look at the archaeological record to see what's going on there, and you kind of bring all that evidence together to bring about sort of 500,000 years ago.
When you think of the genetic disposition to ensure that your genes survive. How does that kind of back then percolate within the dad for him to understand that this was something that he needed to pay attention to and be around for? How does that play out?
Yeah, I mean, it's not a conscious thing. So what would have happened would be that there will be, and we know today, there is a genetic predisposition to be more of a sensitive parent than some people. So some people don't have the genes to make them as some people do. Obviously, it's not deterministic, but it has an influence. And so probably what happened about 500,000 years ago is those fathers or those men who had those genes and were, in one sense, not happy, but content to give up all the other matings. Because until then, they would have simply been like a chimpanzee, mated with loads of different females and just left the females to deal with it. Okay? And that's fine. If the females are capable of raising those children on their own, then your genes are safe. That's fine. You can go off and do that. We got to that tipping point where actually the female wasn't able to do that. And probably a lot of those babies were dying. But the dads who had that genetic predisposition to stick around, their children survived. And then we get this growing genetic predisposition to actually sticking around and caring. And those are the genes that survived because those were the babies that had the nurturance from the father as well as the mother so that they could carry on.
Was that the first instance of monogamy then?
Probably, yeah. So it was... And we aren't actually, as a species, a purely monogamous species. A lot of monogamy is socially imposed. But yes, what would have happened was because the father... Because he basically... If he was going to invest in the offspring, he had to be pretty damn sure they were his. Now, we have a disadvantage as humans because we have what's known as concealed ovulation. So human males cannot tell when a female is ovulating. In other monkeys, you can. Monkeys get big red bottoms and stuff. It's very obvious. So, you can guard that female for that period of time while she has a big red bottom, mate with her, and then leave her to it. We don't have that. So males have to stick with females all the time to make sure that nobody else mates and this offspring is definitely... So, yes, you would have started to have these pairings of males and females, which came from what we call mate guarding behaviour. But over time, that will have developed into sort of monogamous relationships because it's not the case that the baby's born and the father can then say, whoop, job done. Actually, he would then have had to have stuck around in the early stages when she wasn't able to find food. It was a very marginal environment. It was a very dangerous environment. He would have had to have protected her and the offspring to make sure they survived. Then childhood developed. And childhood actually, and particularly adolescence, are major stages for fathers to be involved. And so actually he would have found his pair bond or his mate guarding stretching longer and longer and longer and longer just to ensure that that child actually lived itself.
I'll be careful I don't say mahogany, but the monogamy.
Yeah.
Yes.
You mentioned there it might be a socially conditioned, and you talk about in the book the Naya tribe, amongst others, and different ways about going about social parenting rather than just purely being the birth dad.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about that with the Naya tribe specifically and other examples and how that works?
So we're a little bit obsessed in the West with biological fathers. And we think that the title of dad belongs to the biological father. So we have like stepdad or, that kind of thing. But actually, in many cultures in the world, that's not actually the case. And dad is really whoever steps up and does the job. And in some societies, such as the Naya, they actually have social fathers. And the reason why they have social fathers in the Naya is because they wish to keep the power within the matrilineal. And so what they do is rather than the biological father having responsibility for the child, an uncle or a grandfather from the mother's family will become the father. And that means that all the control of the child, all the influence on the child remains within the matrilineal. And we find that in other societies. So in South Africa, amongst some black populations, because it's actually a very... difficult economy, a lot of biological fathers actually have to go a long way away to work. And therefore what's actually happened there in terms of their culture is they have a social father or a team of social fathers. Quite often it's the grandfathers involved, but there can be uncles, elder brothers, teachers, whatever. And so quite often South African children have whole teams of fathers, and the fathers will, have different names and they will all do slightly different things in the child's life. So I always say that being a father isn't about being involved in conception or even necessarily being genetically related. It's about, are you doing the job? If I look at you and I, have my little tick box of what a father does, if you're doing that, then you are the dad. And I think that's something we have to really remember, particularly in a society now where we're having more blended families, but we're also having people who are using, who are adopting, particularly gay couples who are adopting, and at least one of them will not be biologically related to that child. And therefore you have to, broaden that idea of what a father actually is, I think.
I love the way that the book, in using all these other examples from around the world, as a British guy, I was, challenged with the conditioning that I've been raised as to what father actually means and what it actually entails. But it makes so much sense when you go into it like that. And again, it's adapting to the circumstance, to the situation, and that in turn influences the culture.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's actually one of Dad's real hallmarks, is their immense flexibility. So whereas women are quite tied by their biology in terms of how they can express their role, how they can alter their role, because fathers don't have that physiological, biological process in terms of pregnancy, childbirth and all that kind of thing to go through, actually they can be much more flexible, much quicker in reacting to environmental change. So what we find when we look at fathers around the world is they're known as facultative, which basically means they're the flexible one. They are the one, if environment changes, I'll shift my role. And I'll shift my role to protect the family or do whatever I need to do in this circumstance. So when you look at fathering around the world, there are so many different ways of doing it. And I think that's actually a great joy. And I think as fathers, particularly who worry about what's the right way to do it, in a sense, there isn't a right way to do it. It's what you as a father feel is suitable in the environment in which you find yourself.
It sounds to be quite nice to share the load. What are you doing this week? My wife's away. Do you want to come and look after my daughter as well? Come with me.
Do I want to?
Yeah,
sure.
Yeah.
Let's do it.
I'm trying to get us to create our own village so you can come and look after my daughter. It'd be a bit
good.
easier. Yeah.
Well, no, it just made me think again, it is no wonder. I mean, like, a lot of dads are confused, aren't they, as to what their role is and how society sees them and how comfortable. And it's no wonder when, we're kind of at this point at the moment where all these different shifts and changes.
I think it's particularly hard identifying dad's role now. Like, especially my partner, for example, she works, she's financially very secure. And I think dads are going into this pivotal moment of, I think it's hard to go into it not feeling just a bit useless. I remember I kind of first went into it. It's hard to I found it hard to emote with my daughter straight away. It's funny, I think you're kind of embedded within Western culture that the child comes out and it's unicorns and rainbows. But I didn't have that. It was very flat. And and I always remember this. It was about 2 months in, and my wife said to me, "How much do you love her, our daughter?" And I just kind of grit my teeth and I went, yeah, I love her. But I knew there was nothing there.
Yeah.
It wasn't until probably 7 or 8 months in where I was able to pick her up, chuck her on the sofa, get a giggle back.
Yeah.
And I was like, this is fun now.
Yeah.
And the rough and tumble's a really interesting section of the book. Could you talk a little bit more about that and why that's so important?
So rough and tumble play, I think everyone recognises it. It's that kind of play we generally only see fathers do. Some mothers do it, but not very often. And it's that really, wrestling, giggling, tickling, running around the room, as you say, throwing somebody on the sofa, aeroplaning around the room, bouncing on stuff, whatever it might be. And it's known as rough and tumble play. And it's a really, really critical dad-child behaviour. And in fact, when dads come up to me after I've given talks and stuff and they say, what is the one thing that you would advise me to do with my child? I would say just play with them. Just play, rough and tumble play, because it's got 2 really important roles. First of all, you mentioned that you didn't feel a connection really until you got something back. And that is perfectly normal. The only way fathers can build bonds with children is through interaction. You don't have the head start of all the hormones that come with pregnancy and childbirth and breastfeeding. So the only way you can do that and get those lovely bonding hormones is to do something with that child and get something back. And as we know, babies, particularly if your partner's breastfeeding, for the first few months, you don't really get a look in. It's actually quite hard to find something that you can do. And you don't get any reaction. You don't get anything back, really. So it's hard. And rough and tumble play is brilliant because it's like the uber way of releasing bonding hormones for both baby and dad. It's very, very fast. It involves lots and lots of touch, and touch is the major releaser of hormones. It's a little bit painful sometimes, and that's in one sense a good
Yeah,
thing
I get
because
told off sometimes.
yeah,
so,
but that releases beta endorphin, which is the king of bonding hormones. A little bit of pain, so it's really really good in terms of releasing those hormones.
so a little bit of pain.
A little bit of pain, a little bit of it's
I'm going to
absolutely
hold
fine.
that one.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Anna said
No,
it's okay.
don't deliberately pinch. Don't deliberately
But Anna
pinch.
said.
Yeah, but the idea that it's got that exhilarating kind of euphoric behaviour, and it involves giggling, which releases beta endorphin. Touch, exercise, you get a little bit breathy, beta endorphin, and that beta endorphin is whatever they say about oxytocin, is the hormone of long-term love. So you get all of that, and the good thing is in a time-poor world, it works really well, particularly for Western dads, because it's very, very time efficient. You can play for like 5 minutes, and it would be like hugging them for like an hour.
Is that something that's embedded more in Western culture?
Yeah.
Really? That's interesting.
Because we are time poor, and for whatever reason, it seems to have developed that this is what you can do really quickly. With, if we look at other cultures, particularly sort of hunter-gatherer cultures and cultures where you are operating more as a family altogether, so not really a capitalist society, for example, where the family just move around together and are together. Fathers spend a lot of time in contact with their children anyway, either carrying them or sitting with them on their knee while they chat to their friends or whatever it might be. And so what we find there is they don't need it in the same way, because they have got a whole hour to sit there with their child on their knee giving them a hug, or they are carrying their child through, whatever environment they're in. So they don't need it in the same way. Whereas it's something we tend to see in Western societies.
Okay.
Yeah.
The absent father is something that I find really interesting, because it's something that's kind of been embedded in our culture, and it's something that I grew up with. The Homer Simpsons, the Peter Griffins, the jokes that the dad isn't there, that the dad is kind of prolifically absent. Where has that developed from, and what is kind of the implications of that?
I think if we're talking about absent fathers, so if we talk about the ones sort of absent through work, that's entirely a societal, cultural thing, that we've told fathers that that's your job. You're a breadwinner. You go out, you make the money. The long hours are there because you're doing it for your family. And the fact that you're not really with your kids doesn't really matter, because until very recently, and I still hear the mantra today, you will get the opinion of, well, fathers aren't really that important, are they? Really, because actually mum's kind of the environment of development, and it's the mum-child attachment that matters, and all these, it's all rubbish, but, you still hear these mantras. And so we have this idea that dads don't really have to be there. And also, and I'm going to probably get kicked for this a little bit, and I understand it, but there has been a little bit of gatekeeping, maternal gatekeeping around the role of being a parent. And the fact is that mum is the uber parenting role. And dads, in one way, we can sort of put dads off from it, or we can push dads away from it, is by saying, well, you're a bit rubbish at it, aren't you? You're a bit useless. And actually, my experience of working with dads is they are very rarely useless, actually. But they, in a way, if you're told often enough, you're not very good at this, or you're doing it wrong, then you kind of take that on board and you back off, and you're like, okay. So actually, I think the absent father mantra isn't very helpful. Even in families where there really genuinely is an absent father. Let's say if fathers have been a divorce and the father doesn't have contact. Again, we're like narrowing down on that idea of who the dad is. When I talk to children of single mothers, quite often they will self-identify males in their life who actually, when you talk to them about what that male does for them, they actually do have a father. It's just not a father in the way that we necessarily would define a father. It's always worth asking children, actually.
You get an honest answer.
Yeah.
So in terms of connotations for that, is there the possibility that as a kind of occurrence of dad almost feeling like a sort of afterthought and a second thought away from the more gatekeeping role, as you say, of the mother, that if the father does experience troubles, particularly during the first year, and I know that you had issues with postnatal depression yourself, does it potentially make it harder for the father to be able to know where to look for help, or to feel like that help is legitimized in some shape or form? Does it kind of alienate the dad from also looking after their well-being?
Oh, completely. I think we very much, in everything we sort of say to the dad during pregnancy and during the process of birth itself, is you are the supporter, you are the bag carrier, you are the emotional rock. Everything is happening to mum. And you literally have to take that. You have to take that, and you have to not really show your emotion, and you have to be strong. And it's a completely unhelpful message. It's actually wrong anyway, because we know lots is going on for dad, psychologically, physiologically, all of these things in terms of shifting identity. So first of all, it's wrong, just scientifically wrong. But secondly, yes, it sort of gives dads the idea that really what you're feeling doesn't really matter, and what mum's going through. And, I am a mum, and yes, it is all very difficult. But it's also very difficult for fathers. And all the focus is on mum. And therefore, I think it is very difficult to actually stand up and say, I need help. Because, as a mother, when you start, in pregnancy, I think everyone's always looking after your welfare, always asking after your welfare. How are you? When you go back, when you've had your baby, there's constant checks of checking, have you got postnatal depression? Have you got postnatal depression? Nobody ever asks a father. And in fact, nobody ever screens a father for postnatal depression. We constantly campaign for fathers to be screened as well. And it's just not seen as a priority, even though actually fathers with postnatal depression need our support, because obviously it's going to have an impact on him, but it's also going to have an impact on his family, on his partner. But nobody seems to think that's particularly important. So it is really hard to stand up with no welcome arms saying, please come and tell you how you feel, to go, I'm not coping. And that's really, really difficult to do.
And Matthew, with your experiences of PND, how did you feel around that time in terms of processing it yourself? And
I felt like I couldn't process it because, I processed everything internally. I think there's a section in your book where you talk about there's an American study or something that the parents do before they have, and the success rate of that, and it's more so, instead of going through like the antenatal classes and the fodder of the nappies and, God forbid you get the hospital bag wrong and all that nonsense, which, we could have just taken a bum bag because you get everything in the hospital anyway. I wish there would have been somebody there to talk to my partner and I and go, hey, look, emotionally, you're going to feel a little bit different now.
Yeah.
Your hormones are going to be out of balance. This is going to be a physiological impact on you. Psychologically, it's going to impact you. I read like podcasts and books beforehand, and it was all the fluffy stuff. And I wish somebody would have come up to me and said, look, there's a good chance you're going to find this really hard. Sleep deprivation is going to be a kick in the nuts. It's not all rainbows and butterflies. But I didn't have that. And because during that period, my wife was going through, she had HG as well. So she was sick every single day of the pregnancy. And I just felt like a bit of a bystander. But God forbid I put any of my woes on her or the rest of the family. And it would have been really nice for somebody to come up and just spend a bit of time with dad. And even in the hospital, my wife was like, you've got to ask for skin to skin. You've got to ask for it. And I didn't really know like then. I was like, don't know the importance of it. I do now after reading your book. But it's something that's missed. It's really missed. And I think knowing what I do now, I'm much more confident, if I'm fortunate enough to have a second. But those first year in particular, it was just a whirlwind of emotions that I wasn't ready for. But going back to that study that you talk about in America in the book, I find that really interesting. And that up to the age of 3, the partners that stayed together were still really, really strong.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit more about that? I found that
Well,
really
it's
interesting.
about preparing the relationship, because we know, like, from every single piece of management science ever, that you're a team with your partner, and then you introduce somebody else, and we know that that's going to cause everything to go whoa up in the air, and you're all going to have to like rejig yourselves and work out where you fit together, and that's exactly what happens with a baby. But on top of that, this baby is completely illogical, screaming at you, not giving you any sleep, but you're still having to then act as a team and do everything together. And that's really hard. And again, those of us who work with fathers, and even actually with mothers now, are lobbying people like, NCT or whoever provides antenatal. You need to have at least one class on preparing the relationship. At least one, of explaining to this couple, this is how it's going to be. This is how dad is going to feel. This is how mum is going to feel. As you said, that's going to mismatch at some point. And handling the expectations about how it's going to be, and how can we try and protect this relationship and keep it strong through this really, really difficult thing that's going to happen.
I remember the midwife about 2 weeks in, she came in and she said, look, if it gets too much, just step out the room and then come back in. And I think that's all I got.
Yeah.
And yeah.
It's amazing. We've been... And,
but it's not to criticise her.
No, exactly. And we don't criticise midwives.
Yeah.
Midwives do a really tough job. There aren't enough of them. It's really hard. But for years, we've just saying, all you have to do is just say to the dad, should we just go and make a cup of tea? And just for 5 minutes say to him, how are you doing? and just focus on him. I mean, when I did my first study, and I used to go and see the fathers when the baby was 2 weeks old. So I'd met them during pregnancy and I'd see them when the baby's 2. And I remember walking into the house of one dad, and objectively, he'd had a really easy time. The birth had been really easy. It was a water birth, very easy, nothing awful. I mean, I'd had dads who had the most awful births, really traumatic. But I said to him, and how are you doing? And I left an hour and a half later because all I was there to do was draw some blood. But and an hour and a half later because I was the first person who had said to him, "How are you?" And I just think that's awful because I just don't understand the lack of empathy there. And it is this idea, and it's this cultural idea that dads are literally there as just sort of this add-on, and they're not. When a baby is born, in most cases, 2 people become parents in that room. And okay, you're not on the bed and it's not very dramatic and obviously physiological, but we know that there's stuff going on for you, you know? And the fact that, for example, you still have to ask for skin to skin. You shouldn't have to ask. It should be offered to you. You know, you shouldn't have to, in that position when you're already probably quite stressed, quite emotional, have to self-advocate. You shouldn't have to do that.
What are the benefits of skin to skin?
So the benefits of skin to skin are several. When babies are born, they are really sensory little creatures, okay? And their major senses are their sense of smell and their sense of touch. So things like vision, not very good, hasn't finished developing yet. So skin to skin is really good because, first of all, it allows the baby to really smell you and get to know what your scent is. And touch, as I've said, is the biggest releaser of bonding hormones there is. So if you lie skin to skin, you've got some very sensitive skin cells and hair cells on the outside of your body, and they will trigger the release of oxytocin and dopamine and beta endorphin, and so it will help you start bonding. It helps the baby start to identify who you are because they can't see you particularly. The other thing with skin to skin that's really important as well is talk to them while you're skin to skin because they know your voice. Obviously, they really know your voice, and that can be a very powerful way of bonding. The other thing that's important is it helps the baby do things like regulate their temperature, and get used to the outside world. They've just been dragged from this very benign environment into this very bright, very scary, very quite cold environment. And so it helps them regulate their temperature. And the last thing it does is this wonderful phenomenon known as biobehavioral synchrony, which we see in very closely bonded partnerships, so romantic couples, but between parents and children as well. And somebody is very tightly bonded when they go into biobehavioral synchrony with someone else. And what that means is their physiological markers and their neural markers actually start matching each other. So your baby, when they are on you, things like their body temperature will come into regulation with you and their blood pressure. And if we looked inside their brain, things like their oxytocin levels would start being in synchrony with yours. And nobody really understands how it works or what triggers it. But what it really is that basically 2 separate organisms become one because you actually have the same operating systems. They're doing exactly the same thing. And that's the start of that really close bond. And that is why skin to skin is so important. I think particularly for fathers because they haven't had this 9-month relationship in the same way a mother has.
Oh, it's such a special time as
Yeah.
well. You know, at least I was lucky enough to have that special time, and I just listening to you talk about it now.
Yeah.
Getting all emotional, Matthew. So, and then I'd love to delve a little bit more into, you know, the science around what happens to the father after the birth, you know, psychologically, physiologically, emotionally, because again, I didn't have a clue, and it's not until later years that I've actually found out. A little tiny bit about it, but I'd love to hear.
Well, there's several things. I mean, it's this myth which, you know, women are like biologically primed to parent and men have to learn. And we've had that myth because, again, we see this major physiological thing happening to a woman. We know her hormones change. We've known for like a decade that her brain will alter and to promote the parenting areas of the brain. We know all of this. But until we started looking for it, it was very much felt that, yes, nothing happened to a man biologically when he became a father. And now we know that's wrong. We know men have their own hormonal change, which is a significant drop in testosterone when you become a father for the first time. And that's really, really important because testosterone is obviously the hormone of male sex hormone, and it's really critical that it's at reasonable levels when you're looking for a mate because it makes you more competitive and it makes you more attractive. But when you become a father for the first time, what we need you to do is focus on this family and particularly on this baby. And if you're still raging testosterone and you're sort of scanning the horizon for the next skin, that's not something we want you to do. So, the testosterone's basically got to go. And it does, essentially. So, looking at like the average is between sort of a quarter and a third drop in testosterone.
Does it ever come back?
Only if you cease to have contact with your child. So even in divorced fathers, as long as divorced fathers have contact, then it will never return.
That's amazing.
So, and it's really important that it does that, because obviously we want you, but also we know men with lower testosterone are much more motivated to care. They tend to be much more empathetic. So
Is that why I cry all the time now?
Yeah, you're probably more emotional, and things make you probably feel more emotional because yes, you are suddenly something's like tricked in your brain, and you're now much more empathetic. And the other thing is testosterone, because it's quite a powerful hormone, blocks to a certain extent the impacts of things like oxytocin and dopamine in terms of bonding. So it also means that kind of block is removed a little bit, and therefore, again, it allows you to more easily bond with your baby. So it's a really critical drop. And actually, it's a drop we share with every single species in the world that has investing fathers. So, if you're a reptile who invests in your kids, you have a drop in testosterone. It's just really, really important. And the other thing that happens is men go through exactly the same brain changes as women do.
Because is this true that does the amygdala get bigger?
The amygdala gets bigger because the amygdala is the site of risk detection.
And that happens for men as well?
Yeah. So you get increased grey and white matter both in the core of the brain, which is like the emotional centre of the brain, it's the unconscious brain, and that's where risk detection is in the amygdala, but also that's where nurturing is and sort of attachment focused behaviours are in the core of the brain. So we get increased grey and white matter there, but also in the outer areas of the brain, sort of those skills which are really important for parenting, such as planning ahead and problem solving and attention. You need to be able to attend to your baby regardless of what's going on around you, and the areas of the brain related to empathy. So all of these areas of the brain are promoted and increase in size in both men and women. So actually, men are just as primed to parent as women.
Are these through studies that you've done?
Some of them are through
throughout
studies. So the
years?
testosterone is studies I've done. The brain studies are studies which other colleagues around the world have done in terms of putting men in brain scanners. We're still not entirely sure when the testosterone drop occurs, because in some species where we see a testosterone, it happens during pregnancy, and in some species it happens following birth, following interaction with the baby. And there's a colleague in America who's doing a longitudinal study trying to work out, when does this actually occur? Is it a birth change, or is it just a sort of postnatal change? And we're not quite sure yet.
I was having tea or meeting up with a friend a few months after my firstborn, who's now 7, and we were just having a casual conversation about fatherhood. And I remember I just said the one sentence, how it's a beautiful thing that you put your baby to sleep at night and then you just can't wait to see them again in the morning. And I shut down in this kind of not overly, but beautifully emotional kind of, my throat, everything, tears. And I was like, my body was giving me all these prompts and signs that it was going through exactly what you were explaining, even if mentally I wasn't quite prepared for it. It was all happening.
Well, it takes longer, you see. So the physiological changes happen quite rapidly after birth. Whereas the shift, what we call the transition to parenthood, in men is considerably longer than women. So in women, it's about 9 months until they feel like, yes, I've taken on board this new identity of being a parent. I feel competent in this identity of being a parent. Whereas men, it takes about 18 months. And we don't know whether that's because it just does, or because men in our society tend to be given less time with their children. It takes them longer to achieve competency and longer to feel that they can take on that identity of dad fully. We're not quite sure. But certainly the psychological change takes longer than the physiological change, definitely.
I had a kind of overreaction in many ways to doing more, to sort of work and being, the provider and living with purpose.
Yeah.
And I remember that first year afterwards, obviously my compassion levels went through the roof. Everything you're explaining here makes complete sense now as well, because I threw myself into work. Everything was a yes, I can do that. Even though my diary wasn't quite making sense, I was driving all over the country and trying to cram everything in and everything else, which of course escalated in sort of physical symptoms of burnout and stress later that year. But it was like the kind of blunt object, just trying to throw more at it rather than sort of having that time later to actually think things through and have a little bit more clarity around my role as a father. And as you say, that's when I think the competence came. It was probably exactly around the 18-month mark, but it was just...
And you just figure out a way to do it, don't you?
Yeah.
Like you just figure it out. You just know, like it's all intrinsically, it's 500,000 years of evolution, right?
Absolutely. And I think that's something that we unfortunately have only just started saying to dads. So, when dads say to me, and they read the books and they do a lot of thinking before, and I go, that's fine. Read whatever books you want to read, but just know you actually have got this.
Yeah.
Because you actually have an instinct to be able to do this. Because evolution has prepared you. It's not going to chuck you. Human fatherhood is such a rare thing. Evolution doesn't leave things to chance. It's not just going to chuck you out and then go do that parenting thing and not give you anything to help you. So it's definitely biologically primed you to be able to do it. It's given you the set of skills that instinctively you actually can do this. But I think sometimes because we sort of say to fathers, oh, you're a little bit useless or you're not really needed. I think they think that they have to spend a lot of time reading and preparing and, okay, I know how to do this. Actually, you can do it anyway.
It's already there. It's already there. Are dads more important to the development of boys or girls?
That's a really interesting question because it's hard to say that there is any real difference, but they bring different things to boys and girls. So, for a long time, it was this thing of boys need a dad. They need that male figure. But actually, in recent years, the research that's been done on daughters and fathers is kind of showing us possibly that they're more important to girls.
Because you speak about that in the book as they go through to like teen and
and actually, in one sense, just after I actually brought that book out, some really good research. It was a bit annoying. Some really good research came out on it. Really good, massive study looking at dads and daughters. And if you have a really good, secure attachment to your daughter and you have like that sensitive, involved relationship, first of all, girls tend to get their self-esteem actually from their dads. And so for dads, it's about making that girl feel like she's important to you. And what I've always found fascinating about children in terms of how they know they're important to their parents, if they know they're important to their mum because their mum remembers things like their favourite cereal or to arrange that play date or to pack their PE kit. Whereas for children with their dads, it's does dad spend time with me? And that's how they measure importance. So, and fathers seem to be the key to girls' self-esteem. And we think that's probably, I think that's probably because we live in quite a patriarchal society. In a way, dads are the sign of that patriarchy within the home. And if you're the sort of dad who has a secure attachment to your daughter, knows her really, really well, completely in tune with her, really sensitive parenting, then you are probably going to be the sort of dad who will say things like, it's okay to express your opinions. It's okay to be you. Don't be, you don't have to be quiet and meek and polite and submissive and all these things girls are told they have to be. You are valuable. Of course, you can achieve whatever you want to achieve in life. And because they're the voice of the patriarchy within that household, that kind of explains why girls with secure attachments to their fathers, with involved fathers, that correlates very well with better outcomes in education, better outcomes in their career, better outcomes in terms of the relationships they go into.
Do they take more risk because of dad, do you think?
I don't think necessarily, no. I think it's more about confidence and self-esteem and being like, I'm allowed to be a voice in this room. I don't have to just sit at the back and be quiet because my dad has told me that I am valuable and that and that my opinion is just as important as that person's over there. So I think it's more about that real innate confidence and also understanding what a good relationship looks like. So girls, again, who've had close relationships with their fathers tend to have much healthier relationships as adults.
You're talking about spending time as well. That came up for an episode a few episodes back as one of the best bits of advice that I've ever been given, parenting advice, is they're not necessarily after the quality time, they're after the quantity time, just being there as much as possible.
Yeah, be there as much. And you don't even have to do anything flash. It doesn't have to be a big treat. There's been lots and lots of studies looking at things like just going for a walk or cooking the Sunday roast together or even washing the car. It's just those times when it's just you and them generally doing something, because kids talk better generally to their dads when they're doing something, and just allowing that free flow of conversation and knowing who that child is. And that's what's important.
The little things are the big things.
Yeah,
what are the implications on a child's mental health if the father isn't there? What we tend to find with children who don't have any sort of father figure is, yes, they tend to have poorer mental health. And that sort of comes down to
the overwhelming role dads have in child development. The big role that dads have in child development is, we say they scaffold the child's entry into the world beyond the family. And what that means is they seem to underpin all the behaviours that are linked to surviving in the big wide world. So, things like self-esteem, things like pro-social behaviours, things like emotional regulation, appropriate social behaviours, all those sorts of things. Fathers seem to have a bigger input into than mothers do. And because a lot of mental health conditions are reflected in the social context, things like social anxiety, eating disorders, that kind of thing, are all generally found within the social context. If a child doesn't have a father to help them enter that world, they're more likely to have poor mental health because they just don't have the set of skills and they don't have the resilience. One of the things about rough and tumble play that we talked about is it's developmentally important because it builds resilience, mental and physical resilience. And that seems to be a really key thing that fathers give their children is mental resilience. And the ability to, deal with risk, deal with challenge, deal with failure, pick yourself up, dust yourself off and carry on. And so children who haven't had that are more likely to find the world a bit challenging, really.
Kind of goes back to the importance of a social father if the birth father isn't
absolutely
around.
Absolutely critical. I think all children need to have a father, whatever shape or form that comes in, or fathers. You can have a team of fathers. There are societies where that happens. And, that father might not be the same throughout your different life stages. We know, for example, for some adolescent boys who don't have father figures in their lives, it can be a male teacher later on in life who for some reason is a really good role model and really builds that child's self-esteem.
Yeah.
I'm curious, Anna, there's a huge part of the internet that's very much like the whatabouts, but what about mum? What about this? How did you get, was it because of your partner's experience that you got wrapped into this world and you fight so strongly for it? I just find it really interesting. You speak so passionately and it's so refreshing. And because at times, probably similar to you, I feel a little bit lost as a dad in this world, and to have a clear-cut voice, somebody to stand up there and put their fist up for us is so bloody refreshing.
It came from a personal experience, I think. So I talk about it in my book. It's the reason why I started it. I gave birth to my first child 17 years ago now, 17, and and it was a really awful birth, and I nearly died, and my baby was very ill. And afterwards, I was offered all these sorts of counselling. Do you want to talk about it? And I was like, well, not really, because I was on morphine. I can't remember any of it, to be honest. I was floating on the ceiling, having a lovely time. And it was my husband who had literally watched a slow motion car crash. He thought he was going into hospital to have a baby, and he was thinking he was coming out with 2 dead people. And he saw all that, and nobody at any point asked him how he was, offered him any support of any sort. And I got really angry. I was like, this is disgraceful, because we had gone into it as a couple. We'd chosen to have a child together, done the pregnancy test together, done the antenatal classes, gone to the midwife appointments together. Everything was together. And suddenly it was just like, yeah, no, you can just go and stand over there. And he even had to ask, when all of everything had happened and I was lying on the hospital bed, they'd taken the baby away and I was very high on lots of drugs and there was literally blood everywhere. And they had rushed out the room with the baby, not told me anything, and I apparently looked dead. And a cleaner came in to sort of, clean everything up. And he had to say to the cleaner, do you think she's dead? And the cleaner went, I think, mate, they might have told you if she's dead. I think she's all right. But he had to ask the cleaner.
Oh, my goodness.
And you're like,
What?
oh,
your
my
first experience
God.
Jesus Christ.
So I got really angry. And as an anthropologist who was employed to look at relationships, I sort of went back and I thought, okay, this is interesting, because obviously we have this big mother cult, which is fine. Mother's very important. What do we know about dads? And I went back in the literature and I found loads and loads of stuff on absent dads. Absent dads screw their kids up, very, very negative. But there was literally nothing on the vast majority of dads who actually stick around and do a good job. And I was just like, this is outrageous. Absolutely outrageous that nobody knows anything about them. They're a really key member of society. So that's kind of how I started. And I think probably because it comes from a place of personal interest, but also because I've worked with so many fathers now. And I hear the same thing over and over again about exclusion, about being lost, about being made to feel unimportant. And over again. And I think if you hear that message a lot and you know the science, and you know the science is actually busting all these stupid myths and stereotypes we have about fathers, I think it just makes you yes, a bit enraged, but also very passionate about saying, okay, we are behaving really unfairly and really badly towards fathers. And it's just not on. You know, as an anthropologist, I'm trained to speak what I see. And that's what I see. And I think that's why I do it, because I just think, how can we have such an inaccurate view, which we perpetuate? And, you know, it's not about, and yeah, what about the mums? Absolutely. But there are a lot of people researching mums, and they're doing an excellent job. And we know a lot about motherhood, and all power to their elbow. There is now a growing body of people like me. When I started, there were about 3 of us, and now there's quite a lot of us. But you know, that was something a gap that needed filling. And it's not because I don't have any empathy for mothers, or, you know, I am a mum, you know, and it's not that I'm, you know, bashing my fellow women. I'm absolutely not. But what really enrages me is when people pit mums and dads against each other. I sort of go, if I'm offering dads empathy, then I'm taking something away from mums. No, I'm not. There shouldn't be a limit on empathy. I'm not taking anything away from the woman's experience. But what I'm saying is we also have to identify that there's an experience over here, which we don't talk about. And I don't see why there's a limit on why we can't do that. It's a bizarre argument.
I hope you don't mind, Anna, but I'm calling you the godmother of dads.
Okay.
Is that okay? It might stick.
That's absolutely fine.
Okay,
Yeah.
perfect. So I was wondering again, you've written this amazing book. Have you had much pushback? What does that pushback look like? How's it shown up?
I've had pushback. Yes, there is a certain sector of feminists, and I am a feminist, but there's a certain sector of feminists who found it kind of betraying the sisterhood, because I was a woman focusing on men, and also that group of mums, and it's absolutely fine. And I understand entirely why they are very protective of their role as the primary parent, because I think, you know, there's very little in the world as a woman that can just be yours, because, you know, you're either playing catch up with the men or it's shared with men. And I think a lot of women, it's like, no, motherhood's mine.
Yeah.
Caring for children is mine. You don't get to do that. That's how I define myself. So, and I understand that. But so, yes, I've had pushback from that, saying, you know, well, particularly like postnatal depression in men. Well, all these men, they didn't go through pregnancy, they didn't go through childbirth. Well, they should just pull themselves together.
Is it 1 in 10 men?
It's 1 in 10 men, yeah.
Do you think it's more than that?
Probably, because it goes underreported, because we don't actually ask men and record it in the data. It's only people who do studies like I do and my colleagues do that we find out how many have it. Whereas obviously we get the data from all the midwifery appointments for women. So it's about 14% for women, and I imagine it's probably around the same for men. I mean, the drivers are different, and how it's expressed is different. But I think it's probably around the same mark, actually. But it will be underreported, definitely.
Because just think like how many dads are probably going through it now. And it wasn't until 2 years in where I just did some research. I had to do some digging. And I was like, can dads get this too? And I found out and I was like, oh, okay. That's what this is.
Yeah.
This thing is that's been eating away inside me for the past 2 years. And it was just the most incredible release. But in hindsight, it would have been great to be able to work on some systems and communicate with my partner better at the start. And just,
and there's so many things
and
we can do to do that, about handling expectations, about, you know, like the bonding thing. A lot of men, one of the feeders into their postnatal depression is the fact that they're not bonding with their baby. And they maybe look at mum, and mum seems to be like the gold standard, and she seems to be bonding beautifully over there, and I'm literally feeling nothing, or even resentful and negative about what's happened to my life. And just by saying to them, that is completely normal. Absolutely normal. I would say probably the majority of men don't have a rush of love when the baby comes out, actually, because they haven't had that head start of pregnancy and childbirth. They haven't been carrying the baby around for that long. They've probably been alienated in the birthing room in some way. And you know, so it's not going to be like that. And because you have to do it via interaction, it takes at least 6 months to get a glimmer, I think, of feeling and love for this child. And that's perfectly normal. If I asked any of the men I've studied, they would have said absolutely categorically, you know, how you feel about the baby at a year is fundamentally different to anything you felt around birth, or even at the sort of 3, 4, 5 month mark.
I think so many dads would carry guilt with that, though. Like
Of course they do.
Massively.
And one of the guys I had
felt
got
like there was
really
genuinely
bad,
something wrong with me.
really bad postnatal depression, because he didn't think his baby liked him. He didn't feel like he was doing a good job. He felt he was letting his partner down. And that, you know, he couldn't do anything with this baby, because as soon as this baby was given to him, the baby screamed. And then he just felt really stressed. And so he handed the baby back and then immediately stopped crying. And he'd be like, okay, obviously, I'm just really crap at this. And if we had prepared that dad and gone, no, that's perfectly normal. You've got to develop a bond with this baby. And it will take time. So just chill, okay? It will be fine. You've just got to go with the flow. Don't get disheartened. And please do not look at your partner and go, oh my God, she's amazing at it. She's had a really cracking head start. You didn't get that. So it's all about expectation. And it's about expectation of those first 6 months, saying you're not going to have that much of an in, particularly if your partner's breastfeeding. It's hard. And we say we suggest a couple of things that fathers might do, like, be the one that does the bath, or baby massage is really good and it's protective against PND, actually. So be the baby massage
Taking that for next time, baby massage.
Baby massage. Be the baby massage person. But don't expect it to be, as you say, unicorns and butterflies, because it's not going to be. It really, it's hard.
It's fascinating, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
It is.
Yeah.
But Anna, that's bang on the hour spot. But that is, honestly, thank you so much. I said previously before we started recording, we came across somebody had shared a TikTok of yours, and it kind of spoke everything what this podcast is about. And for so many dads who'll be listening to this for the first time, and maybe they're going through that period of, oh, why don't I feel a connection? Why don't I feel a bond? To hear you say that it's perfectly normal for the first 6 months. And I wish somebody would have said that to me, because it would have kind of changed my outlet, and it would have changed the first few months for me. But dads, if you are listening, it does get easier, and as soon as you start chucking them about on the sofa, it's great. And that's when dad time comes in. So, yeah.
Well, Anna, the godmother of dads, thank you so much for coming on. I wish we'd found you 7 years ago, but thank you for the work that you're doing. For everyone listening who might want to look and read a little bit more about you, where should they find you?
Well, I'm on Twitter and on Instagram at Dr Anna Machin, and I have a website which is just annamachin.com. There's lots of articles and podcasts and that.
There's some great blogs on there, actually. I was reading through that this morning.
There are.
Really good.
Yeah.
Really good. Anna, thank you so much.
Thank you.